In today's tutorial, I'll be going over how to set up a scene inside the Cycles engine in Blender and go ahead and render out a material with some depth of field and good lighting. I will be using the NodeIO add-on for importing materials, so if you haven't already looked at that video for importing materials using that, you can take a look at our previous video. Though you can also just import the texture maps. It's just going to be something I'm going to use to speed up importing a material. In order to get started at the blank Blender scene, I'm going to go and switch the engine from Blender Ender over to Cycles Render. Then I'm going to select everything besides the camera and delete it. Next up, I'll hit Shift A, go to Mesh, and add in a plane, and I'll scale this up by, say, a factor of 8. So you can hit S, then 8 to scale up by 8. And I really don't like this viewport widget in, so I can go down here to turn off the manipulator widget. Cleaner view. And next, what we need to do is import our material. So I'm going to do this by opening up a new window, then going to the node editor, and I'm going to, with my mesh selected, go over to the materials tab here and hit new. Now, like I said earlier, I'm going to be using the NodeIO add-on for quickly importing my material. If you like, you can just import your textures regularly, but this definitely speeds up the process quite a bit, makes it less a hassle. Go to source, go to the material I've downloaded, and select the B nodes item here, hit accept, then hit import node tree. And I'll have a new material here, so I'm just going to get rid of that last one. And then I'm going to take the height map output. But first, I'm going to plug that into a math node here. And the reason I'm plugging it into a math node is the height is going to be probably much too strong. So I'm going to want to multiply it by a value of like 0.5 or 0.1 in order to reduce its strength. Plug that into displacement. All right. Now if I go into material mode, it'll probably be solid brown. Should be. And it is, because we don't have UVs set up yet. I could have added UVs when I spawned it in, but I'm going to go to the UV image editor, then hit tab to go into edit mode on my mesh, hit U, then unwrap. And I want to make sure this is actually tiling and the edge of this plane is the very edge of the UV border. So I'm going to go to the bottom left here and change the margin down to 0. To ensure it's actually taking up the full space. And next, I'm going to want to move my camera a bit to kind of figure out where my camera's going to be looking before I decide how I want this to be tiling. So I may want to tile this a little bit more. So the best way to do this is to select your camera and hit 0. And now you'll be looking through the camera. I'm going to hit T here to get rid of this window over on the left. I'm going to move this over just a bit so I have some more room to see. So what we're going to want to do is hit N and then click this locked camera to view button here. Now when I move around, I'm moving the camera. So I'm going to position it here to where I'm seeing nothing but the plane. I'm going to get an angle about like this. That looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the lock camera view just so I don't mess up this angle now. And then what I'm going to do is hit N to close that. Head back over here, and I'm going to want to go ahead and place in a sun lamp. This won't be the final lighting, but I want to get an idea of how this is going to look. So let's just rotate this. I know I'm going to want pretty, somewhat harsh angles, but we can change this more later on. And I can go ahead and hit render. And it's much too dark, so I'm going to take the sun strength up to 8. With the sun selected on the right here, you can go to the sun tab and up the strength. And that's quite a bit better. I'm also going to give it a bit of an orangey or red tint. Very, very subtle. As even such a small amount can have quite an impact. Let's take this up to 0.85. All right. Now I'm going to want this material to displace, and to speed up rendering here, I'm going to go for my rendering tab and turn on this little border checkbox down here, and then turn on crop. And that makes sure it renders only what the camera sees, so I'm not wasting any time rendering out here. So we need to have displacement, and I want to use the materials displacement. So I click my mesh here. You can see we have our height map plugged into displacement like we had before. Let's move these out. I might unpackage this node soon. So first things first, we need to make sure our material actually has the geometry in order to be displaced. Right now it's just one big single polygon, so that won't do much. So I'm going to go to the modifiers tab, and I can go to add modifier, and then go to subdivision surface. And I'm going to change it to simple. Simple will simply subdivide it without averaging the location of the vertices. Another very quick way to do this is to hit Control, then any number on your keypad. So Control 1, Control 2, Control 3, and that will also add in a subdivision surface modifier. So I'm going to do Control 6, and it looks like the hotkey doesn't work for that. I'm going to take the view up to 6 and turn it to simple. Even that isn't really that dense enough to see it. I'm also going to take the render up to 6. So when I hit render, it will actually subdivide that many times. So I hit Z, I can see the wireframe barrel to see how many vertices there are. And so that's probably a good amount for us to preview the look, though when it actually renders, we're going to want to have still quite a bit more. So I'm going to have it set to 2 here on this next one. I'm going to turn off the view to 0 here. So now it's going to subdivide 6 times, 7 times, 8 times. So we should have a very dense mesh. Now, before we get the subdivision to work, we need to go over to our render settings here and turn on the experimental feature set. Now, this isn't too dangerous of a thing to turn on. I know it has a big warning sign here. But they've had this experimental set in here for a very long time. The displacement's very safe to use. I've never had a problem with it unless you decide to just crank up your subdivision insanely high. Then you'll probably get a crash. The other thing I'm going to do is change my device from CPU to GPU computation. You want to do this if you have a good GPU, though if you don't have a good GPU at all, then just use CPU. So now if I hit render, it's still not going to be displacing properly. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to the material and change the tiling sum. So if I hold down left click and drag across all 3 of these, I can edit all 3 at the same time. And I'm going to hit 2. So now it's tiling a bit more. All right. So now I'm going to hit the material tab here. And after turning on the experimental feature set and render settings, if I go all the way down to settings here, I would then have a displacement option. And it's bumped by default, but I'm going to change that to true. And nothing happens. And that's something important to note with this true displacement in the render settings is it only actually updates the displacement after you go back to material, then go back to rendering. It's a little bit annoying. As you can see, it's actually displacing some a little bit now, not too much. Probably subdivide this once more using the levels here in my second subdivision surface. And then I'm going to go back to the material here and set this to 1. So let's see if this looks like a full strength. So go back to material, then go to rendered. Okay, so now we're actually getting much more displacement. But as you can see, the shading is off here. And that's because the polygon was being flat shaded. So I'm going to hit T. Then over here under Tools and Shading, I can hit Smooth to smooth out the normals of my model. That looks quite a bit better. All right. So with this step here, I can kind of play a little bit more with my light. And I'll also be importing an HDR sum. So let me select my light, go back in with the 0, go to rendered. Then let's rotate this light a little bit. All right. Something else I'm going to change here real quick is the transform of the view. So if I go over to the scene tab here and down to color management, we can see the view is currently on default. And I'm going to want to change that to filmic. You can see it just changed a little bit there. The reason I'm changing it to filmic is that a filmic view is more in line to a real camera. So your renders will look more like a real photo or like real video. So now that we have it on filmic, I'm going to go back into material to make things run a little bit more smoothly. And I'm going to go over back to my node graph here. And I'm going to change this to world. Now, the reason I'm over here in a world is I want to import an HDR map, though I need to turn on use nodes, and now I can. So we're going to plug in an HDR map, and you might think the first thing to do is to plug in an image texture, but you're actually going to want to plug in an environment texture. And that will recognize it as an actual equirectangular image. So let's plug this in, and let's hit open. And I'm going to navigate to where I have my source images. So I have a source folder here where I have my HDR and then my material I'm using. So I'm going to just grab my HDR that I'm using for this project. And now if I go back into rendered view, we should see some lighting info from that. All right. So that's what it looks like with the HDR, and if I put this to 0, you can see what it looks like without. So we're getting a bit more light info across everything. So I'm going to put this to, say, 0.6, maybe 0.5. And I think I may want my light a little bit harsher shadows. So I'm going to change the rotation of this again. Let's head back in, hit render. All right, that's about what I want there for that. So real quick, I'm going to hit Control S to save this. In case we get a crash here. Let's see, that's not the correct folder. Let's go back to here to source. All right. Introduce to rendering in cycles. Rendering cycles. All right. Save Blender file. Now we can hit spam Control S every now and then just to make sure we're actually saved. So now let's change our camera a little bit. So currently, default cameras in any rendering engine are very much not realistic. Everything's perfectly in focus, which a real camera just can't do. So if you click on the little border here, you can actually select the camera itself. You can also go up into hierarchy to select it. But once it's highlighted, you can go over to the camera tab here, and then we can turn on some depth of field. So let's go ahead and turn on our limits. And what limits does is show us where the camera is currently focusing. So I want it to be focusing right about above the ground plane because this is going to displace up a little bit. So I'm going to get in the ballpark area. So if I go back over the depth of field, I can change the distance and get to, say, right about here. Next, I'm going to hit 0 to go back in, hit render, so I can view what difference this is making. So I'm going to hit T to close this, get more space, and move this over so I can see a little more clearly with what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to change the size to 0.05 here and the radius. And that's a little bit severe here, but you can see the depth of field actually activating here and there. So I'm going to change this back down to 0.03. Yeah, so let's try 0.035. And later we can actually render this to test and see how it looks. So with that, I believe we have full render setup here. In a moment, we will take a look at a few more render settings to get it finalized and make it look quite a bit more pretty. All right, so now I'm going to go through the process of getting my render more optimized and set up to get it a much more better render, but hopefully not having the render times take too long. The way we can do that is by going to the rendering tab, and if we scroll down, we can see our resolution, but also under sampling, we can see how much it's sampling the image to improve quality. Now, what I like to do is go down the sampling and change it over from path tracing to branched path tracing. And it's going to freeze for a second. All right. So the reason why I like going to branch path tracing is it gives me control over each individual ray tracing path. So you'll want to increase these more depending on what areas are getting the most noise. So the most common areas you're going to want to improve is the anti-aliasing and the diffuse. Improving the anti-aliasing can improve all other channels quite a bit. As you can see down here, I can see the total samples for each individual ray trace path. If I up my anti-aliasing, you can see how it increases everything. That's because this is the first ray trace path that comes out of your camera before it starts calculating the others. So you have more of these, you're going to have more of those. So if I up the diffuse now to say 2, you can see it goes to 16 because it's 2 times 16. Take up a 3, now we have 8 of these and 3 of these, so the total is 24. That's how the math is going there. So what I'm going to do is have my glossy at 2 and my diffuse at 4. Because this material is not really too glossy. If I was working with something more like polished copper or anything like that, then I'd want to have glossy quite a bit higher. And everything else I'm going to keep at 1 for now, since I don't have any volume or subsurface scattering going on in this material. And I'm going to up my sampling quite a bit to 20. You can also go to sampling presets here and hit final. And that will give you a more final look. But usually it's a bit too high in some categories like volume, or maybe a bit too low in others. So I'll just go to final and put this back up to 4, and then change my sampling to 12. Let's do 14 actually, and change the diffuse back down to 3. It's going up to what was 3000 diffuse is quite a bit, and will take a little bit too long to render. Though, of course, it's very subjective depending on how clear you want your image to be. There are some people who quite happily spend 80 hours letting an image render to get a really clean image. So let's hit Control S to save again, just so we can remember all that. And I can hit render to see how things are going to look. All right, I'm going to close the sampling here and go over to my light paths. Now the default is pretty good. It's not quite truly realistic. It'll be hard for us to see a difference here unless we do a full final render. So I'm going to go to the integrated presets and hit full global illumination. And as you can see, it just maxes out everything here to 128. If you hover over it, it'll give you a tooltip saying what it's doing. Basically, a ray is going to come out of your camera, and it's going to hit each surface of your material and then bounce around the scene. So the higher these numbers are, the more you're allowing the light rays to come out and bounce around. So you can get much more accurate lighting. It'll also drastically increase render times. So I'm going to go ahead and render an image here and then cut back once it's done rendering to show you what this image looks like currently. And we can render by either going up to render, hit render image, or you can just hit F12. So let's do that. All right, my preview render has finished and I can take a look at it. And the reason I say preview render is we didn't finalize all of our resolution settings. So we're just using the default resolution settings in Blender right now, which up here we can see is 1920 by 1080, 50%. So it's actually taking these two values and cutting in half. And I did this to get faster render time so I can quickly preview it. So it should be instant for you that are watching. All right, so now I can take a closer look at this and kind of get an idea of what I need to improve on it. And I'm going to decrease my depth of field quite a bit. It's a bit too severe for my liking. So I'm going to go back to the camera here and change the size to 0.025. And then I think I will go back over here, select my mesh, and increase the subdivision just once more for the render. So now it's 6, 7, 8, 9. And you're going to want to be very careful with doing this because it can definitely crash your computer if you just go way too high. All right, so let's go back to our render setting and let's up this to 100% now. So this time it should give us a very good clean result. And something else you can try out after doing a render is you can go over to the scene settings here and mess with things like exposure. You don't have to do this before, so it does this post-processing afterward. So we can mess with the gamma and the exposure on this if we want to adjust some more. We can also use curves or add in more contrast to the look here. I can add in very high contrast. Let's put this back to 1. So 0 and 1 are the default here. I can also go to very low contrast or just base contrast. So you can mess around here to get something you like. Though I'm going to use none. Alright, I'm going to save again before I render. This is a good chance. Not necessarily a good chance, but there's always a chance you get crash in render. It's a good practice to save beforehand. Alright, so I'm going to render this once more and we should have a final picture. Alright, I'm back and the render has finished in 23 minutes. So now with this done, we can either render again in an even higher resolution and more sampling to get much cleaner results. At the beginning, my first image, I had that rendered at 150% of 1920 by 1080. So you can actually go up to the 10% even though the bar is maxed out. You can type in 150 or whatever you want. Just be careful if you put the high value, it's going to take a very long time to render. But I did it at a higher value so I could be zoomed in and still have at least 1920 by 1080 pixels on screen. So now that our render is done, we can save this out by either going to Image and Save as Image, or we can just hit F3. And then we can title our image. So I'm just going to call this Final for example. And then we can change how we want to save it. So we can do RGB with an alpha channel and edit our color depth. So if you want to keep this raw or uncompressed, you can either have it as PNG with 0 compression or take the TIFF, and that will give the cleanest results with no compression. But if you're going to web, you're probably going to want to put it at PNG and an 8-bit color depth to get a much smaller file size. Then we can up the compression to make the file size even smaller, and it will still have very good quality. But if you do JPEG, then it's going to compress it and can cause lots of artifacts if you have compression. So if you were to do JPEG, you could actually do 0 compression and it will still look very good unless you upload it somewhere that compresses it. I can hit Save as Image after editing anything I want down there. And alright, and that concludes this tutorial for rendering in Cycles Engine.